I'm wondering where the lines are for you. What's the line in the sand when you wield awesome power of government? What is that line for you? Because clearly lying to a court isn't a red line. Referring to follow court or refusing to follow court orders isn't a line. Doxing judges and government officials isn't a red line. Intimidating attorneys you supervise into doing things they believe is unethical is not a line. So what's your red line? I really wonder, what could the president ask you to do that you wouldn't do? What wouldn't you do to win?
Senator Cory Booker asking Emil Bove the $64 million question. He's Donald Trump's pick for a lifetime appointment on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. Chilling question, just how much further he will go, and if there is any line that he wouldn't cross in service of Donald Trump. A new Senate questionnaire offers a terrifying glimpse of what the answer really is. In the questionnaire, completed as part of his Senate confirmation process, Bove refuses to rule out Donald Trump running for a third term as president. Responding, quote, as a nominee to the Third Circuit, it would not be appropriate for me to address how this amendment would apply in an abstract hypothetical scenario. Bove was given the opportunity to clarify that response. Instead, he repeated his response, which is nonsense, several times. It's unconstitutional. The amendment, I guess Bove is referring to, is the 22nd Amendment, which states, quote, no person shall be elected to the office of president more than twice, end quote. Pretty clear, unambiguous, one might say. But not to Bove, who didn't stop there. When asked if he denounced the January 6th insurrection, he said this, quote, the characterization of the events on January 6, 2021 is a matter of significant political debate and subject to ongoing litigation. Thus, as a judicial nominee, it would be inappropriate to address this question. Really? Ask Mike Pence what he thinks about that. And he was asked where he was on January 6 when Donald Trump and his supporters tried to stop the peaceful transfer of power. He said he couldn't remember. Joining our conversation is co-founder and executive director at Protect Democracy, Ian Bassin. Michelle's still with us. Ian, I remember where I was standing when the events of January 6th started to transpire. I remember what my husband, Mike, and I said to each other. I remember the sources I called to try to understand what happened. And I remember just about everything that happened on the air once I raced into work and came up early. And I don't expect that every single person in this country remembers exactly where they were, but everyone who's ever been part of American government surely knows where they were on January 6th. That feels like the first and most obvious lie.
And it tells us how far we've come that, right after January 6th, you had the leaders of the Republican Party, Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, make clear that a red line had been breached and been breached by President Trump at the time. And now we have nominees for lifetime appointments who can't even bring themselves to condemn, let alone January 6th itself, one of the most damaging and dangerous moments in the history of our constitutional republic. But he couldn't even bring himself in his answer to just condemn violent attacks on law enforcement. And I wonder how the law enforcement community feels about someone who can't say that in their application to a lifetime judicial appointment.
Ian, I mean, what does it say that neither one of us would probably bet, much, waiting for law enforcement en masse to speak out and oppose someone like him?
Look, I worked on judicial nominations when I was in the White House counsel's office. And already at that point, we were getting to a stage of almost kabuki theater with these nominations and questionnaires and hearings in which nominees basically felt that it didn't really matter what they said in their questionnaires or even what they said in the hearings, because the votes were kind of baked in largely along partisan lines. And I think this questionnaire is sort of the apotheosis of it, right? Here's someone who basically is saying whether a president could be elected to a third term or not is, I don't know. It's a question he can't answer yet. And, look, I get the way these nominees say, well, it's a question that could come before me, but there are provisions in the Constitution, like what is a well-regulated militia in the Second Amendment, that is open to interpretation. But there are other provisions in the Constitution that you better give a pretty clear answer, right? The original Constitution counted Black Americans in the South as 3/5 of a person, and we fixed that in the Constitution. If you asked a nominee to the federal courts today, do you believe that's been fixed, or do you believe that our Constitution still should count Black Americans as 3/5 of a person? You better bet that person says that's been resolved, but they should have anywhere near a federal court or any other position of responsibility to go. And the 22nd Amendment, as you pointed out, is clear. But this is how the Overton window moves and shifts. And it's up to senators to start putting lines down. And I would point here to Senator Thom Tillis, who said recently that anyone who couldn't clearly condemn January 6th was not getting past him. And then he opened the door to voting for Beauvais. And unless he's going to put his foot down here, you're going to have Beauvais assume that he's entitled to this seat.
Michelle, the Overton window is something that we've tried to track, right? And it's almost lost its usefulness as a tool because there are no windows. There are no more frames. There's no more perspective. They have now turned, the Trump White House in this iteration has turned the Republicans in the Senate into ghosts, into shadows of what they once were. Nobody thinks that they're for someone who's against the Constitution being on the bench, but we all know that they'll vote for him. Nobody thinks that most of them are for halting military shipments to Ukraine, but they'll all support Donald Trump. Nobody, I was a Republican. None of them are for tariffs the way Donald Trump is applying them and using them as weapons. And none of them will exert what is actually their authority over tariffs. How do we cover this moment when the Republicans in the Senate are doing things that they have never until this moment supported or believed in?
You remind them of this. You refuse to accept this as normal. You get out into the world and talk to their constituents because they're not doing that anymore. They're not going to do town halls. Normally, August would be a month where members of Congress, or senators and representatives, would be out in front of their constituents, hearing from them. I'm willing to bet that very few of them are willing to do that now because they're going to get an earful about many of the things that we've been talking about and some of the things that we have not gotten to yet, including the cuts in Medicaid, including people's discomfort with the way that the deportations are being carried out. And so we use truth as our guide. We are informed by history, and we call them out and remind them that what they are doing. You know, it's interesting when many of the people who voted for the so-called beautiful bill didn't even read it. You know, so there are people who are doing things that that they don't believe in, that they're not comfortable with. Loyalty is they're governed. They are governed now completely by loyalty or by fear.